All right. Hello. Welcome back, everyone. This time to the week on the presidency and the California governor. I'm going to try to famously go faster than I have in the past. Got about 40 slides, but luckily a lot of pictures. So here's the first one. Sorry for the graininess. But when we're talking about the presidency, um, it's worth stressing that one of the key features of U.S. democracy has been peaceful transition of power from one person to the next and from one party to the other. Here you see President number 42, sorry, Bill Clinton, on the right there, and number 43, George W. Bush, George Jr. here. Clinton elected in 92, Bush in 2000. 8 years later, after Bush's second term, President Obama is elected, and Bush, the Republican, peacefully hands power over to Obama, the Democrat. We all know what happened in 2016. President Obama, on his way out after 2 terms, hands the keys over to incoming President Trump. And then 4 years later, Trump was not reelected, which had been the case with all the previous presidents you've seen. And he decided not to meet with incoming President Biden at the time. Vice President Pence, rather ceremoniously, I think professionally, respectably in his way, stood in for outgoing President Trump and met with Biden and welcomed the new president and the new first lady to the White House. So anyway, but the presidency is pretty important, right? We do know that Article 1 maps out the Congress, Article 2 maps out the executive here, which leads a lot of folks to say that perhaps the Congress is meant to be the more powerful branch, the first among equals. But nonetheless, Article 2 does give the President of the United States some pretty useful powers, right? Most broadly stating what you see here, the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States. Right, two important elements here. We don't get a clear definition of what the executive power is, right? Which leaves the door open to interpretation that hopefully you'll gather by the end of these slides has led to a very, very powerful presidency. Whoever is in office, whichever party they represent. Arguably, this day and age in the 21st century, if the founders were somehow revived and brought back to life, they'd probably be rather concerned at how powerful the presidency has become. And something that will be the theme in the movie Vice that you could choose to watch for this week and take the reading quiz over. That's a pretty good sort of dramedy, I've heard it called, but it's about the approaches to what some call the unitary executive theory of the presidency in the United States, right? That this unitary executive embodied by a president really holds more power than any other institution or individual within the government. I'll leave it at that. There are other things that we could say about this. I make a couple other mentions of Vice throughout the slides. But anyway, worth contrasting this with the plural executive in California, right? The executive in California, the governor is, of course, the face of the state. And I've got some slides at the end here specifically on California. But the president should not be simply equated with, or the governor of California, or the governor of California shouldn't be equated with the presidency of the United States in practice. And we'll spell that, why that is the case exactly, at the end of these slides if you haven't read the Van Vechten chapter already. I've mentioned the Electoral College a couple times in slides up to now. This first link here, hyperlink, the Electoral College, presidents chosen by the Electoral College, is a rather spoofy take from The Daily Show when Trevor Noah was still the host on how this rather indirect and rather undemocratic institution still exists, right? Was intended to provide a peer review of sorts for the presidential selection. It was like the founders not trusting the sliver of the population, right? Adult landowning white males who could vote. The founders still didn't trust those folks to make the right decision. So the Electoral College is a roundabout way of providing some sort of peer review over the popular vote. The following link here, where I say here's a more serious take on the Electoral College, this is from NPR, and it is, as I say, a much more serious take on the Electoral College. If you want to chuckle, watch the first link. If you want to actually better understand the Electoral College, listen to the second. However, this college has been about as dysfunctional as Humboldt State getting housing lined up for the fall 2023 academic year here, right? It doesn't always do what it's supposed to do. Hillary Clinton in 2016 was the second Democrat in 16 years to win the popular vote and lose in the Electoral College, right? The first, of course, had been Al Gore, who lost the popular vote to George W. Bush, who you saw on the first slide, despite having won the popular vote, right? So in the case of Clinton, though, 3 million votes was the largest popular vote margin for a candidate who lost the popular vote, right? It's the largest victory by percentage for someone who lost the Electoral College. I'm missing the word college there, since Samuel Tilden's loss in 1876, right? Anyway, won't dwell on that. Continuing with Article 2, we can talk of the different types of powers that the president has in our system here. They're expressed powers that are, as the name implies, very clear. They're delegated powers, which I'll map out in a sec on a separate slide or two, and then inherent powers, which are those claimed by the president that are not expressed but are inferred, right? And again, this is why that, what is executive power question left open by the Constitution has only served for president after president, regardless of party, to claim powers for the presidency that are not expressed in the Constitution, right? We'll flesh out some of these right now. The most basic here, or the clearest, are the expressed powers, right? Which would be military powers that the president has as the commander in chief, right? Presidents have effectively used this title to make war, right? We do know that Congress must declare war, although Congress hasn't done that since World War II. Presidents do have a lot of leeway to use military force, especially when under immediate threat, right? That's an expressed power of the president, right? Presidents have certain judicial powers, right? So in addition to naming justices to the Supreme Court and judges to the federal bench, presidents can also grant pardons and amnesty for those convicted of federal crimes, not of state crimes, which might be interesting to see how things play out for a certain former president as the 2020s develop. But anyway, we can also talk of diplomatic powers, right? The president is the chief diplomat of the United States. Presidents negotiate treaties and receive foreign ambassadors and heads of state. The hyperlinks here are both rather silly. The grant pardons one, I think, is to a Hassan Minhaj. It was a stand-up comedian from California. Parents are from India. He's a pretty funny guy. But on granting pardons, and then the chief diplomat is a Saturday Night Live spoof, I do believe, making fun of former President Trump. Moving right along. But here you see, we're all familiar with these types of photos. You can remove Obama and plug in another president, and it won't look unfamiliar at all with troops and the flag and so on and so forth, right? But this is one of these constant and iconic visuals we get of any president, right, at one point or another. Presidents, again, deal with other states directly. Here you have former President Trump in his mid-70s, with his wife in her mid-40s, with the president of France in his mid-40s, and his wife, who I think at the time was probably in her late 60s, early 70s. Quite the contrasts in a lot of ways in leadership and in personal choice making. But anyway, interesting cases here. It's what presidents do, right? They meet with foreign leaders. President Obama, then President Obama, quite famously thawed relations with Cuba in 2015, right after the midterm elections of his second term. So he didn't really have to pay a political price for having done that. President Trump thawed relations quite famously with North Korea, the first U.S. president to meet with the North Korean leader. Did that in 2018 or so, 19 maybe, I don't recall. The photo on the right here is Trump at his first NATO meeting, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I believe the guy with the blue tie was the Prime Minister of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And you can see Trump reaching from behind the guy to pull and push him out of the way so Trump could be in the forefront of a photo of NATO leaders. Very classy. The diplomacy here, hyperlink, is yet another Saturday Night Live clip making fun of a certain former president. But anyway, continuing here, the expressed powers. Again, we know, I've stressed this, that the president shall take care that the laws of the land be fully executed. That's where the term executive comes from. And to do that, the president may nominate executive and judicial officials, right? I've talked about this already in this set of slides. But it's important to consider how presidents have limited legislative power, right? Any president gives information to Congress and recommends measures, right? Presidents, Biden led the charge for COVID relief bill. President Trump's biggest legislative push was the 2017 tax cuts. President Obama is, of course, famous for the Affordable Care Act, or the Obamacare bill that informally carries his name. But institutionally, the executive is also linked to Congress, right? So the vice president, whoever that is, right now Kamala Harris, is the president of the Senate, right? And thus holds the tie-breaking vote when a tie-breaking vote is necessary, right? So 100 senators, 2 from each state, 50 states, 100 senators. If there's a 50-50 vote, then the vice president can step in and break that tie as a voting member of the Senate. Presidents also have the veto, which I think I've mentioned a time or two, or last week when we talked about checks and balances. Right? So just because Congress passes a law doesn't mean it automatically becomes law. President has to sign that bill into law, and presidents have the right to veto legislation. Right? This is, of course, used more commonly under divided government than united government, as the numbers show us here. This goes all the way back to the late 1700s. Orange is divided government. Blue is unified government. The blue here, the spike of vetoes under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, had a lot to do with the legislation that was passed during the Great Depression, right? That's when Roosevelt was powering the run-up to World War II, and he quite famously pushed the Democrats further to the left, and vetoed a lot of legislation that he thought didn't go far enough to protect the interests of U.S. citizens who were suffering during the time of the Great Depression. But since then, since World War II, we really see vetoes are increasingly rare and increasingly done during times of divided government, which makes sense, right? You've got Congress controlled by one party, the White House controlled by another. And if the White House doesn't agree with the legislation passed by Congress under control of the other party, well, then that's what the White House can do. Of course, there are politics involved. Presidents don't like to have their vetoes overridden, which Congress has the constitutional right to do, another check and balance. So usually when votes are passed, especially during divided government, observers tend to know whether or not a president's going to sign it or not. And if Congress doesn't have the votes to override a veto, for example, then Congress might not pass the bill to avoid the embarrassment, right? So it becomes a game of chicken. And you can see that in the 2000s, we don't see very many vetoes at all, right? It's not very common. But anyway, moving on to the delegated powers here, right? So Congress creates agencies by law, right? We understand this. That's what the legislative branch does. It legislates. But what Congress creates often then has to be, it's created under the executive, right? Because the executive carries out the laws, right? So if Congress creates something, I don't know, like the Environmental Protection Agency, which was signed into law surprisingly under President Nixon, California conservative, it's then the executive's purview to run that institution, right? So that would be a delegated power. The president is sometimes given authority directly and sometimes given authority indirectly through the power to appoint agency officials, right? So again, Congress creates a new agency. Department of Homeland Security is the newest secretary level institution, and created by Congress, signed into law by the president, and the president names the person who runs it, right? I've mentioned once already in this batch of slides, Congress, since World War II, has chosen to delegate the use of force. Again, abdicating Congress's constitutional authority to declare war. What Congress does is it passes a bill declaring or authorizing the president to use force. You'll see this come up very clearly in the last film of the semester called Why We Fight. It's about why we fight. Sorry, my daughter is kind of mumbling in the background here. Inherent powers, bebe, inherent powers that the president has. Are those, say, to bring legislative agenda before Congress. I would kind of call this a legislative power of sorts, but Lowy and the textbook call this an inherent power. But yeah, any president has the power to basically ask Congress to do what the president wants. And the three bills I mentioned a minute ago are the ones I mentioned here, right? Obama's Affordable Care Act, Trump's tax reform, Biden's COVID relief package, right? The president also has the power to issue executive orders, particularly ones that say state how the president is going to enforce laws, because that can vary from president to president and party to party. So when you have a new president come in, think Trump post Obama signs a bunch of executive orders to undo things that the previous president had done. Biden did the same thing coming in after Trump. Whoever succeeds Biden, especially if they're of a different party, will do the same thing. This hyperlink is to a Saturday Night Live skit that very much makes fun of President Obama for abusing executive orders. I mean, all presidents sign them, but this one is, I believe, how a bill does not become a law. And it is funny. It's worth the 5 minutes or however long the skit is. I would recommend watching that. Another inherent power that the president has, of course, as I try to keep moving, is to fire cabinet members, right? Presidents can't fire judges once they've been named and appointed. But anyone who serves in the executive branch as a presidential appointee can be fired. They serve, as we say, at the pleasure of the president. Shifting gears historically here, I like how the Lowy textbook does this. Walks us through the evolution of the presidency. I mentioned at the outset here that all presidents have sought to expand the role of the office and the power that the office holds, right? So it's not by any stretch controversial to say that presidential power has varied over time. But that most of the U.S.'s institutional history leading up exactly to FDR and the Great Depression can be described as, I've seen it in different textbooks, even going back to when I was a student, the legislative epoch, the legislative era. But this was when Congress dominated federal policy making. I asked facetiously here what the founders wanted. Likely is very much the answer. Again, there's no document that says from the founding fathers, we listed Congress first in the Constitution because we wanted Congress to be the most important branch. But I think it is pretty clear because we saw how institutionally the country functioned for the first, nearly 150 years. And it was one that was more dominated by Congress than by the presidency. That changed with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his famous New Deal. Again, in the midst of the Great Depression, the New Deal introduced new interventions in the economy and regulation of business in particular by the federal government that necessarily meant a larger role for the chief executive in day-to-day governance, right? This was the birth of liberalism in the United States. And I'll explain what I mean here on the next slide. But before I get to that, I want to stress that this larger role for the president that FDR carved out for himself at the time has only expanded since the 1930s, right? The role of the president or the presidency has arguably gotten more visible, more important, more influential in U.S. politics since this time in the country's history about 90 years ago. Let me give you a brief aside on liberalism. I don't talk in here very much yet, at least, about the day-to-day of contemporary U.S. politics, but it is important to clarify some meaning of words here. In the United States, right, we tend to use the term liberal to mean someone who supports government intervention in public policies that increase equality of outcomes. generally associated with the Democratic Party, right? Not so much equality of opportunity, which tends to be something that our Republican friends defend tooth and nail and think that there is equality of opportunity for everyone in the United States, which I think is fair to say isn't exactly true in practice. We also don't see equality of outcomes in policies, but that's generally what a liberal in this country uh, defends, right? And to achieve that equality of outcome, liberals tend to favor greater government intervention in our daily lives, right? That's why you hear like my conservative uncle back in Kansas talk about that damn liberal Hillary Clinton in this way, right? But that's not what the word traditionally has meant, and it's not what the word means in English in a lot of other places. Why is this different? Why do we use the term liberal and progressive, for example, almost interchangeably? Well, it goes back to FDR and the New Deal. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was called a socialist by his political opponents, right? And this is the 1930s, so not that long after the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. We, of course, didn't know what was coming down the pike with World War II. And it's worth reminding ourselves that the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States against the Nazis in World War II. But nonetheless, socialism, which is what people associate with communism in this country incorrectly, is it's a bad word, right? And it was back then too. So Roosevelt was aware that this label of socialism is what conservatives were going to call his policies. So he decided to call them liberal, right, to contrast them with conservative policies of the Republicans at the time, right? Continuing with this thought here, what FDR was calling conservatism was actually what we call classical liberalism, the John Locke's, right? That's a classical liberal, right? The Adam Smiths. And what FDR was proposing as liberalism was a very modest form of what is correctly called democratic socialism, right? FDR was democratically elected. He worked through a democratically elected Congress. And what he passed, like Social Security, which has been pretty well received for the last 90 years, is socialist, right? I mean, it's a form of democratic socialism. But FDR's meaning of liberal versus conservative was adopted in the United States. That's why we still use these terms today, right? Democrats are generally pretty liberal. Republicans are generally pretty conservative. These are the terms we use and we have for nearly 100 years, but it's not the case in most other English-speaking places, right? Liberals in the UK find their home in the Conservative Party. The Liberal Party in Australia is the Conservative Party, small c conservative. Most conservatives in the United States are what we would call neoliberals. Neoliberals tend to be very much in favor of the freest markets possible, least amount of government intervention in the economy as possible, et cetera, et cetera. So a bit of a history lesson, but relevant. I think it's important that we understand how words are used and why. Because if on the off chance you're doing a study abroad from the UK, you're probably nodding your head going, oh, okay, that makes sense now, because things have been maybe confusing up to now. But anyway, let's continue with with the U.S. president and think about resources of power, right? Formal power resources. The vice president would be one. Sometimes vice presidents are pretty influential. Sometimes they're mere window dressing. Sometimes vice presidents become more influential after serving. This link will take you to, it's got to be pushing 20 years old, but a Jimmy Kimmel Live clip of an actor portraying Al Gore and climate change. I'll leave it at that. It's short. It's worth a chuckle. I've seen it a million times, and it makes me laugh till I cry. But I'll talk about vice presidents on the next slide. The cabinet, of course. These are the secretaries and chief administrators of the major departments of government that report to the president, right? So, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary General, who's the country's top lawyer, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Transportation, blah, blah, blah. Down the list we go. These are people that the president is meant to trust and count on because, again, the president appoints them to those positions, right? The executive office of the president gets a little further out from the president as a person, but these are the permanent agencies that help the president manage the executive branch, right? These are more bureaucrats than the cabinet members who deal with the nitty gritty of how to get things done. By issue A, the executive office of the president just is the support staff there, along with the White House staff made up of analysts and advisors who work directly for the president. The advisors link here will take you to a silly Saturday Night Live spoof of the Trump administration playing The Bachelor or The Bachelorette. I don't know how we want to call it with advisors. It's a bit dated now. It's still kind of funny. Here, I threw together some photos, a collage, if you will, of recent vice presidents. Top left, you have Al Gore from Tennessee. Again, the case probably, well, aside from Joe Biden now, Al Gore, until Biden came along, probably was the most influential former vice president. And Gore has been influential outside of politics, but basically just crusading to get us to think about climate change. He's been doing so for 20 some years. There he is, famously smooching his wife on stage. And 20 some years ago, he took a big hit for that. To the right there, we see Dick Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president and really the mastermind behind the Bush presidency, according to many. You will see him portrayed in the film Vice, not always very kindly, but I think Christian Bale does a good job of playing the part. But Cheney had been a member of the House of Representatives. Prior to becoming vice president, he had served as Secretary of Defense under George H.W. Bush, Bush's father. So he's a well-known guy in Washington and a good person for Bush to know because Bush had only been governor of Texas and didn't know Washington that well. Same applies to Al Gore. Sorry, I jumped ahead. Al Gore had been a senator from Tennessee, had served in the House prior, and he was the vice president for Bill Clinton, who had only been governor of Arkansas. And while a smart guy, didn't have the Washington experience he needed. Biden was Obama's pick, somewhat surprisingly, according to many. Some insiders say Obama offered the position first to Hillary Clinton, who decided to be Secretary of State to pad her foreign credentials to then run for president eventually. It didn't turn out so well. But Biden served 4 years as vice president, and Obama needed a guy like Biden. I think he needed a white guy to not scare off any more white voters than possible with him, not being white. He also needed someone with a lot of experience in the Senate, or well, in the legislative branch, period, because Obama had served part of a term in the Senate before deciding to run for president, and he lacked a lot of international experience that Biden did have, having chaired the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee for quite some time. Mike Pence stepped in for Trump. Pence, in addition to being also a senator, also had served in the House, also had been governor of Indiana, so lots of experience and a good Christian, which helped clean up Trump's image a bit. So he had institutional knowledge and socially just served to be a good balance, even though, a demographic balance, if you will, even though they're both old white guys. And then Kamala Harris, the current vice president serving under President Biden. I think that is an obvious pick as well. In this greater age of inclusion, Biden being the old white guy, the oldest white guy to ever be president, he definitely needed someone younger, someone less white, and a woman did not hurt. And this, you Californians should know better than anybody. Kamala Harris had been Secretary of Attorney General of the state of California. She'd been a senator. She knows what she's doing, right? And I think functions in that way as a good vice president, even though none of them really do much. Arguably, Dick Cheney is the one who did the most behind the scenes, but you'll see that in the Vice film if you choose to watch that. This just maps out the institutional presidency. You see the president in the middle. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but this just maps out the cabinet, the executive office of the president, the staff, etc. Contrast this is from the Lowy text. Contrast this with this visualization from the Katznelson book. You don't have to read the Katznelson chapter for on the presidency, but I just threw this in to show how maybe to visualize the relationship between the president and these different other institutional sources of power, right, emanating out from the president. Anyway, were we in class, we could discuss this. I might throw this out here when we meet virtually. Which of these following presidents was the most effective, influential, or notorious? This is going back all the way to 1960 to Kennedy. There is, of course, no right answer whatsoever. I mean, even if you absolutely despise, say, Donald Trump and say he's obviously the most notorious, I could throw out some counterexamples from most folks on this list, regardless of party, and explain how and why they might be just as notorious, if not more so, but in a different way. Same goes for influential and effective. There's really no right answer, and of course, if you do have a strong feeling about one president and one of these adjectives, it's probably colored by your political leanings, which is not a bad thing at all. But just be cognizant of it, right? Moving on here, let's think about political parties, right? Presidents rely on their partisans for help, partisans, people of their party, but presidents cannot control their party. Definitely saw that under the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and even to an extent the Biden administration. Um, this is not a parliamentary system that we live in. There are no immediate consequences imposed by the party if someone doesn't toe the party line, right? And we can see examples of this in the recent past. Even in 2009 and 10, Obama had very large Democratic majorities in both chambers of Congress, right? They rode the Obama coattails for a pretty big Democratic wave in 2008. But he still had to negotiate with Republicans, right? Especially after the midterms of 2010, where Obama lost unified government and had to deal with divided government. The Trump administration worked not that well, I say here, with GOP. That's a Republican majorities, the grand old party, it's called GOP majorities, and didn't have everybody on board for everything Trump wanted to do. He did get the tax cut pushed through in 2017, and that was really about it. Because by 2018, the Republicans were pretty well shellacked in the midterms, and Democrats took over in the House. Biden came in with a very slim majority in the Senate and a majority in the House when he was first elected, and that lasted until the 2022 midterms when the GOP won the House by 4 seats. So Biden still now has a very slim 50-50 majority in the Senate, and does not his party does not hold the House, but that's another story for another day. The House after 2022 has been rather chaotic, rather divided against itself. But anyway, here we see presidential success on congressional votes, what Lowy calls here the presidential batting average. You can see under the red line, if you see yellow, these are periods of divided government. And what we're following here is a percentage of congressional votes in which the president took the position supported by Congress. So when president and Congress agree, is most of the time generally, right? That's the red line ticking sometimes upwards of pushing 100%, but it's at its lowest during periods of divided government, which should make perfect sense to you, right? We see presidents get done what they want done when their party controls the houses of the legislative branch, right? But shifting gears a bit, and this helps us to explain why presidents have gained so much power in practice since World War II. This notion of going public. This is a tactic by which presidents seek to force members of Congress to support their policies by appealing directly to and mobilizing the public. I hated this as a kid whenever the president came on TV, and there before cable even, and there were only a few channels and the president was on all the channels. That's the president going public. Luckily, you younger people never had to deal with this directly. But it was torture for us 80s kids. But presidents over time went public throughout the 20th century through public speeches and on radio and television, and of course now through the internets and the Googles, right? As I facetiously ask here, have you heard of this thing called Twitter, which I guess is now X? I'm not on the tweets and the twats, but and I just never got into it. But yeah, that was a presidential thing for quite a while under a previous presidency. But I think or I asked the question here, what of going public in the age of polarization? I think the access to media, both that presidents first had to control the airways of sorts, goes back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who gave fireside chats over something called the radio, and then increasingly through the back end of the 20th century television. This greater presence of politicians in the media able to communicate directly to followers via the anti-social media. Going public in the era of polarization, I think just makes us more polarized. If you don't like whoever the president is, you don't want to see that person on any screen, likely. There are a few of us who still, have our political leanings and opinions, but don't want to throw our shoes at the TV when we see somebody from a different party. The hyperlinks here, the speeches, I think this is to something involving Trump and Colin Kaepernick. It's a bit more serious. It's from The Daily Show. Maybe watch that if you're interested in such things. The television hyperlink, I think, takes you to an early campaign ad of anyone, but of Lyndon Baines Johnson, which basically says, vote for me or we're all going to die in a nuclear holocaust. It was really the first campaign ad to raise a lot of eyebrows. It's a very short clip. I would watch that if you're interested. Military campaigns, a great way for presidents to go public and gain public support for whatever they want to do. If you're, if you were old enough on September 11th, 2001, to have a memory, you remember this visual here. This is George Bush, I think, on the day after. Maybe I don't know the exact date, but on the rubble of the World Trade Center, basically saying we're going to go after everyone who's behind this. And that transitioned then to President Bush, I think on the 20th of September of 2001, announcing that, we're going to invade Afghanistan. Tough luck. It was the you're with us or against us speech. But support for George Bush at the time was really high. Support for Congress was impossibly high among the public. And it had a lot to do with the fear at the time, right? And this is despite the fact that George Bush won the 2000 elections and lost the popular vote, right? He was not a popular president before 2000 or before September 11th, 2001. And then he was for quite some time. Presidents can go on television. Again, this is, the age of media. Here we are. It's the 21st century. President Nixon was the first to go on TV, not on a news program. And now it's kind of normal. Well, it's not exactly normal on any given program, but it's not uncommon for us to see a president on TV talking to somebody like Ellen DeGeneres, who I think has been sort of canceled. Anyway, or fired, right? This guy, a former president, this was before he was president, but, I have a feeling that we are going to see, for better, for worse, sadly or happily, depending, I don't know, we might see more celebrities, folks who have solid name recognition, choosing to run for office, which as a political scientist, I don't necessarily love. But anyway, public appearances by presidents. This is just interesting info. It is discussed in the book. So, I leave it in here, but you can see how these have ticked up over time. I think it just stands to reason given how media works now in the 21st century. I don't think I need to dwell on this. Surprisingly, though, despite the fact, or maybe because we see presidents more and more and more, what happens with people you see more and more and more and more and more? Eventually, you get tired of them, more or less, right? And we see, going back to LBJ, right, to Lyndon Baines Johnson, support for presidents dwindles the longer they stay in office. A real exception to that rule was President Clinton, who survived in an impeachment in 1998 and bounced back pretty strong. I think he had a good economy at his back to really help for that. George W. Bush, you can see after September 11th, the support for him skyrocketed to over 80%. And then by the time he left office, he was not popular at all. Even a lot of Republicans had turned their backs on him. He also, oversaw, it wasn't his fault directly, but the 2008 financial crisis, I'm sure, didn't help on his way out. Obama came in very popular, dwindled a bit. Support for Trump stayed pretty level all throughout, for reasons no one can seem to explain. But anyway, moving on here. Basis for presidential power, the administrative state. As the limits of going public have become more apparent, right? Contemporary presidents have turned more and more to their executive powers to satisfy their goals. So, increasing the size of the executive office of the president, increasing the role of regulatory review, and so on and so forth, increasing use of signing statements, executive orders, and executive agreements. Executive agreements are like treaties, but presidents just say, hey, it's an executive agreement and not a treaty. Thus, it doesn't have to be ratified by Congress. Presidents can step around obstacles better than other institutions of government to try to get done what they want to get done. Here is President Reagan issuing a signing statement. This is basically what presidents tag on to bills where they might say, this is how I'm going to execute this law. And sometimes presidents quite cheekily just say, basically, I'm not going to enforce this law if they don't like it. It's not often, but all presidents do it. And it goes back to Washington, where presidents basically think they can semi-legislate with the stroke of a pen. But you can see that they have gone up over time. This goes back all the way to 1900. I'm sorry, I've got the edge chopped off there, but significant executive orders signed by presidential term. So you can see that this happens. Obviously, there's no mention of presidents or parties, but you know that there's changeover here. Both parties do it, is where I'm going with this. We saw a real downturn in the mid 20th century. I don't know exactly why that is, but the trend is to go up. Discussion question here. So, is the rise of presidential power good for democracy? The $1 million question. I'll ask you this when we convene via the screen later this week, likely when you watch this, or next week when you watch this. Some people might say yes. The presidency is more directly accountable because it is a unitary institution and it's more highly visible. We can hold the president better to account, maybe, at the very least at election time, but presidents do tend to listen to public opinion better than other branches of government do. Of course, reasonable people can disagree and say absolutely not. The presidency cannot possibly represent the views of some 333 million Americans, and it's too hard to hold the president accountable. I could argue either sides of the coin, really. I think it's easy to understand how and why the role of the presidency has expanded since World War II because of media, how it's evolved, how we've evolved as consumers of media, etc. But as a political scientist, I can say, hey, let's maybe pump the brakes on this presidential power, because the problem is once it's amassed, it's not relinquished, and that's kind of the end point of the Vice film too. If you watch that, so keep this in mind when you watch Vice. Right? Is the rise of presidential power a good thing for democracy? $1 million question. But anyway, last couple of slides here, and I'll stop talking. The plural executive in California is unique. This notion of a plural executive was rejected by the U.S. founders, regarded as inefficient, competitive, and fractious. Thus, the founders opted for a single executive, right? The a president, after the failures of the Articles of Confederation that lacked a president, right? So this plural model was adopted with the revised California Constitution of 1879, and it's made up of 12 people in 9 offices that share power, right? So the governor is the first among equals, the prime minister, if you will. The governor is the face of the state, but is only one of 12 executives within the state system. I'm not going to read the list here. But worth mentioning, the last one, the Board of Equalization, has 4 members, and it oversees tax policy. Very boring stuff. My dad's an accountant. I guarantee you it's very boring stuff. But the plural executive here, each member has its own duties. and to carry into effect state laws, policies, and programs makes perfect sense. That's what an executive does. All positions are limited to 4-year terms, and there are term limits as of a 1990 proposition in the state that voters decided on, which, again, direct democracy, unique in California. I'm not against it by any stretch of the imagination. But it limits members of the executive branch to 2 terms or 8 years total in any one position. After that, there's a lifetime ban. So you can't ever serve in that role again. But remember, this is as of 1990, and that matters when I get to my last slide here. What this has turned into a game of musical chairs of sorts. According to Van Vechten, executives run for other executive positions. So this guy, John Chang, has gone from the Board of Equalization to controller to treasurer and can only serve 8 years max in any one of those positions. Former Governor Jerry Brown had been Secretary of State from 1971 to 1995. That's a long time, a lot of reelection. And governor for one term in the late 70s to the early 80s, and then again in 2011 and 2019. And that was allowed because he had served prior to the 1990 decision to impose term limits. So he was grandfathered in. Interesting fact there, but that's just a trivia knowledge for you, but relevant for you folks in California. That's all I've got here for the executive. Hope you learned something, and we'll see you soon enough. Bye-bye. Bebê, fizeste bem. Fizeste muito bem. Vamos para cá.